disgusting. A black woman, dressed like a maid, daring to carry a Chanel bag. Charleston, Saturday morning. Dana Monroe, a razor-sharp federal prosecutor, is shopping for her husband's birthday gift when a white cop shoves a gun in her face, sneering, "You don't belong here." The sick system of racism rears its ugly head, marking her as easy prey. But 5 seconds later, her husband, a formidable military strategist, steps in. No shouting, no threats, just one chilling question that makes the gun waver and the cop lower it, unraveling the hollow mask of a corrupt system. When honor is laid bare, can the law stay silent? What state do you live in? The blazer hung silently behind the glass, lit from 3 angles by a soft white-yellow glow, as if the store itself were declaring, "This is not for someone who simply wants to look good, it's for someone who knows exactly what they're looking for." Dana stood a step away, unrushed. Italian silk, blend cashmere in pale ash gray, the lapels cut deep in the traditional London tailoring style, and the row of brown leather-covered buttons, the detail Marcus once exclaimed, "Rarely do you see a jacket made this precisely and beautifully." She didn't look at the price tag because it was a gift her husband would like. In truth, there was no need to. What she was choosing wasn't a matter of cost, it was about the perfect alignment between a gift and its recipient. She pictured the moment he opened the box, his eyes brushing over the wrapping paper, pausing at the shoulder seam, and with just a slight nod, she'd know she had chosen right. She had never been to this store before, but the moment she stepped in, she knew she didn't need to go anywhere else. She had tried 3 other places, one too loud, another cold and sterile, like a luxury showroom meant only to display, but this one was different. There was a modesty to it that didn't hide the sharpness of its curation. She moved among the racks like walking through a second-hand bookstore where no staff need to push a sale, because those who know how to read will find the page they need. She picked the blazer within 3 minutes. No need to try it on, just handed it to the staff, asked for a careful wrap, and clarified it was a birthday gift. They understood instantly. Every fold, every piece of tape, every ribbon tied was done with care, no excess. What Dana wore that day wasn't something people would remember long, but it couldn't be dismissed, either. A crisp, white buttoned-up shirt, cream straight-legged trousers, and smooth, chestnut-colored leather flats. No strong perfume, no metal accessories. Only one thing made a few glances linger longer: the classic Chanel bag, limited edition, worn but not worn out, its soft leather still glossy, its hand-stitching still tight. It was the gift Marcus gave her last year, after she won her first human rights case in the South. Won might not be the right word. The convicted received only a symbolic sentence. But to her, it was enough to trigger a wider investigation, enough for a family to know their pain wasn't just an echo in a void. Marcus understood that, so when he gave her the bag, he simply said, "You need something worthy to carry alongside you." She stepped out of the store just as the street began to crowd, left hand holding the large paper bag with the blazer, right arm carrying the Chanel close to her side. Not rushed, not slow, just walking like someone who had done what she came to do and didn't need to prove anything to the world. The sunlight tilted gently, reflecting off cafe windows, glinting like hundreds of tiny sparks across her hair each time she turned her head. It was a Saturday morning, an ordinary morning, and it was also the last morning she would still be seen as a woman of color out shopping, before every gaze, every assumption, and an entire entrenched system turned its weight toward her, just because someone couldn't stand the idea of her being somewhere they didn't think she belonged. Riverside Row wasn't as noisy as the commercial strip across the way, but its message about who belonged there was far clearer. The black wrought iron gate, the walkway paved with coarse stone, the neatly lined shrubs, everything was arranged with such cold precision. Outside was the street, inside, a private world where silence seemed pre-programmed into the recessed lighting and thick, sun-bleaking curtains. Dana knew this area. She'd walked past it a few times, never once thinking she'd stop. But today, Crossing the road to turn onto a side street, the one with the antiquarian bookshop Marcus had once mentioned, she found herself walking along that same sidewalk, quiet as breath. Her eyes scanned a map fixed to a lamppost, searching for the next turn. The sun wasn't strong, but bright enough to make the map glare. She squinted, holding the gift package tightly, and walked slowly toward the corner where the turn began. A faint sound came from across the street, unclear whether it was a hinge creaking or a door's bottom brushing against tile. Dana didn't turn, but at a glance she saw a white woman standing in a doorway. The woman said nothing, didn't move. She just stood there, back straight, one hand resting lightly on the wooden frame as if ready to shut it at any second. Her hair was styled into soft waves and slicked back, a look that made her face seem even more rigid. A fitted, wine-colored cashmere sweater paired with a short strand of pearls. Her gaze passed over Dana's Chanel bag, then settled on the hand holding the gift box, and finally on Dana's face. A look that said nothing out loud, yet delivered three things in full: judgment, suspicion, and a silent verdict, as if, in just 3 seconds, she had decided this woman didn't belong here, and certainly shouldn't possess what she carried. Dana turned away without responding, without showing offense. Years in her profession had hardened her to stares like that. What she didn't expect was what happened the moment she stepped out of sight. The woman picked up her phone. No one heard the conversation. No one knew exactly what she said, only that a quiet summary was entered into the local police department's internal system. A message so brief no one bothered to trace it back. Black woman with luxury bag loitering suspiciously in secure residential area. Please check. No additional notes, no image evidence, no detailed description. But within minutes a patrol car was dispatched. No sirens. No urgency, just a preset directive: respond and verify. In that system, verify was rarely a neutral act. Dana remained unaware. She was still standing at the map, eyes skimming the list of turnoffs. There was no rush. Her day's tasks were nearly done. She only wanted to find the bookshop, pick out a collection of essays Marcus liked, and then head home to cook a simple dinner. She held the blazer package close, partly to block the breeze, partly from the instinctive habit of someone used to living under scrutiny. But within minutes, the presence of a uniformed man with an alert stare and a hand hovering near his holster would push her day onto a different course, where every plan, every assumption, and every bit of faith in society's basic order would begin to crack. The patrol car slid in like an unannounced shadow. No siren, no lights, no screech of brakes. It simply appeared quietly, like a premeditated intention, a presence that carried no overt punishment but held the silent authority that society had granted it for generations. Inside sat Chad Brenner, not hurried, not bearing the tension of someone responding to an emergency. He didn't leap out like in a chase. Instead, he lingered, observing, as if weighing whether what he was about to face was worth it. A black woman, modestly dressed, carrying a designer handbag, standing alone on the sidewalk, holding a paper bag like she'd just finished shopping. To Brenda, that peaceful scene triggered nothing but suspicion. No need to wait. Brenner stepped out. Each footstep is a statement. I have authority here. He didn't greet, didn't introduce himself, didn't explain. He opened with a command. Can you stop for a moment? Not a question, a reminder of hierarchy. That she, Dana Monroe, whoever she was, whatever she was doing, had been placed under scrutiny, under her skin color and the object in her hand. She turned around, not surprised, not resentful, just looked straight ahead, like someone who knew exactly what kind of danger she was stepping into. She knew this type of approach. It required no concrete reason, just a disapproving glance from someone in the neighborhood, a vague phone call from a person who never asked to provide proof, and the system would set into motion. Precise, efficient. As always, Brenner cited the usual excuse, received a report about a suspicious individual, then listed the description: female, black, carrying a designer bag. That was it. No weapon, no violent behavior, no theft. Yet enough to launch a confrontation between law enforcement and an innocent citizen, because in this society, there's an unspoken rule. A black person who looks unusual is a cause for suspicion. Dana didn't back down. She asked directly, "What law am I breaking?" But Brenner didn't need to answer. He looked at the Chanel bag as though it were evidence of guilt. Someone like her shouldn't own something like that. At least, not in the framework of his predetermined worldview. When she pressed further, his response was to raise his notebook, that administrative weapon used to legitimize any form of wrongful control. By now, all eyes on the street had turned toward them, not because Dana was making a scene, but because of the contrast. A black woman, standing still, unarmed, being questioned in public, for simply existing in the wrong place, with the wrong image, against the wrong expectations of someone in power. A woman walking her dog paused, gripping the leash tighter. A teenager in the distance pulled out a phone, needing no explanation. Everyone could see clearly this wasn't a check. This was a cop using the law as a pretext to impose racially charged suspicion. And anyone who had ever been treated that way, asked to prove their innocence simply because of their skin, understood. Power doesn't need to shout to be oppressive. It just needs to stand close. Dana didn't retreat, nor did she yield. Her gaze locked onto the officer before her, as if peeling back the layers of performance behind his actions. She had faced dishonest witnesses, handled cases filled with deliberate legal ambiguity, but this wasn't a debate about law. This was a performance of bias, staged for an audience called society, directed by a system that instinctively sided with those in power. When she asked whether a white woman carrying a Chanel bag would be stopped like this, Brenner didn't answer. He didn't have to. He knew. Even if that question rang out in broad daylight, the system would find a way to ignore it, and if necessary, it would twist the truth to fit the prejudice it had long accepted. Disgusting. A black woman dressed like a maid daring to carry a Chanel bag? Reasonable suspicion. The phrase slipped out like a well-worn password. A pass that could turn any ordinary act into a pretext for control. No evidence, no specific witness, just someone who didn't look right. Brenner held up a small notebook. No legal documents, no detainment order, no investigative warrant. But the system treated it as enough. Do you have identification? An ordinary question on the surface. But for a person of color, it always carried risk. Every movement toward a wallet, every hand reaching into a pocket, could be interpreted as a threat. Dana slowly opened her bag. She wasn't shaking, but she knew this. Brenner's eyes were no longer those of a man simply doing his job. They were the eyes of someone waiting for a mistake, eager for the moment that would justify using force without consequence. His hand slid closer to his holster. He didn't draw, but he didn't move away either. That dangerous in-between state, shielded by the word precaution. Precautions against what? A woman reaching for her wallet? In that instant, Dana understood she was no longer standing before a person, but a system made flesh. A reflex that didn't need confirmation, didn't need cause, only the right kind of target. People around them began to see more clearly. A man at a cafe paused mid-sip. A kid with a skateboard stood still, phone in hand. They didn't step in, but they saw. And that spreading silence, not one that hides, but one that exposes, made the absurdity of the situation louder than any shout. Dana handed over her driver's license. Not because she had to, but because she understood. Refusing would give Brenner a reason to escalate things beyond control. Inside her wallet were her federal employee ID, bank cards, and an old family photo. But she didn't need to show all that. A license was more than enough to say she wasn't suspicious. And yet the other hand, the one on the gun, remained exactly where it was, as if her innocence was the true offense. I haven't done anything wrong. You know that. The words weren't just for Brenner. They were for every system that allowed people like him to operate without question. Brenner said nothing, didn't act, didn't explain. But in his mind, the scenarios played out. If she had raised her voice, moved too quickly, failed to meet his gaze, this could have ended with a gunshot. And then the system would write the rest. What Brenner didn't expect was that just seconds later, that very system would be forced to reckon with itself, not because Dana said anything more, but because someone else would soon step forward and flip the whole board. Dana was always acutely aware of things that white people of her class never had to think about: the speed of a movement, the angle at which she reached for her wallet, the distance between her hand and her purse. She knew that her body, though unarmed, was always tagged with danger, not because of what she did, but because of what others were ready to imagine. So she moved slowly, deliberately, not out of fear, but as an act of intelligent self-defense. She dipped her head slightly, lowered the Chanel bag to her side, left hand gripping the strap, right hand calmly opening the flap. Inside, everything was in place. A simple black wallet, no zipper, no clasp, the kind chosen for how easily it allowed her to retrieve a card without any sudden motion. Dana slipped her hand into the center compartment, touched the section where her ID card was kept, a gesture anyone might have performed thousands of times in life. Yet for her, at this moment, it felt like a high-stakes exam. Every second, every move could be interpreted in the most dangerous way. She didn't breathe heavily. She kept her eyes on Brenner, not out of fear, but without defiance either. Just the alertness of someone who knows exactly where she is and what she's up against. Brenner wasn't watching like someone expecting cooperation. He watched as if standing in front of a threat that might explode at any moment, even though all she was doing was retrieving the ID he had asked for. His right hand had already been resting near his holster, and now the distance between his index finger and the safety latch was almost nothing. No warning, no order to stop, no instruction from a superior, no pressing situation unfolding. Just instinct, an instinct trained by years of seeing black people as default suspects, whispering to him, "Be ready." Dana pulled the wallet out. Her hand was steady, her movements remained smooth, but the instant she lifted the card from the slot, Brenner moved. It wasn't a half-second of hesitation. It wasn't a gesture of intimidation. It was a fully offensive act. He drew his gun. With both hands, he pointed it directly at her. A woman standing still, non-resistant, no sudden moves, no threatening behavior of any kind. His eyes locked onto her, as if the most natural thing in the world was to believe she might shoot or pull something out. And because that possibility existed in his mind, even if it wasn't real, he gave himself permission to pull a real weapon. The atmosphere dropped. It was no longer a quiet street, no longer just an exchange of information. The moment had crossed a line. An armed officer pointing a gun at an innocent civilian in broad daylight in a neighborhood labeled safe. But safe for whom? Not for Dana, clearly. Because of her skin color and even the bag she carried, it was her very presence that was seen as a threat. And no matter what she did, in the eyes of someone like Brenner, and the system behind him, her attempt to protect herself or simply exist in the right place was enough to trigger a violent response. The sound was so faint that anyone not paying attention would think it was just the click of a purse clasp. But for those who've heard the whisper of metal brushing against a leather holster, it was a signal, a boundary just crossed. Brenner didn't shout. No warning, no demand for Dana to stop, no hands up like in training drills. He simply drew his gun, smooth, clean, fast, as if it were a reflex hardwired to the sight of a black person reaching for a wallet. His body didn't tremble. His gaze didn't flinch. His finger hovered near the metal that could decide a life. Dana didn't step back. She didn't speak. She understood. Any sound from her right now could be interpreted as provocation. She raised her hand. Slowly, very slowly, not out of submission but to stay alive. Her right hand still held the wallet. Her left lifted, open, as if her bare palm now had to stand in for her identity, her background, her dignity. There was nothing in her hand, but everything she was, in the eyes of the man before her, was still seen as a threat. Around her, the world began to move in unnatural ways. A young woman walking across the street gasped, barely restraining it. Oh my God! Quiet enough not to be accused of interfering, loud enough to let the outrage spill out. A man in a hoodie near a lamppost raised his phone camera, his hand starting to shake, not from fear, but from knowing this moment might become evidence or a crime scene. A schoolboy on a bike skidded to a stop in the street, nearly falling, his face frozen in alarm. No one screamed, no one rushed in, but one by one, glance by glance, they all understood what was happening. A woman who had done nothing wrong was being held at gunpoint, in broad daylight, on a city street, for doing everything right. 3 seconds, enough for an entire block to shift its atmosphere, from calm to shivering, from watching to stunned. No sirens needed, no flashing lights, just a gun, a warped idea of reasonable, and a police officer ready to pull the trigger because he feared his own imagination. Brenner remained silent. No hesitation in his mind, no moral question, no memory of oath-bound training. Only one logic remained. Anything that didn't fit the mold he'd absorbed, from books, from TV, from those before him, was a threat. And if it was a threat, he had the right, or more precisely the backing, to use force to control it. Dana stayed still. Her eyes weren't locked on Brenner. She looked through him, as if he were the physical stand-in for something invisible she'd been confronting her whole life. The system's silence when people of color are presumed guilty. He didn't need to speak. At this point, any word could be twisted. She stood, not as someone subdued, but as a mirror, reflecting the full absurdity of the gun aimed at her. Then, from the far end of the street, the low growl of an engine drifted in. A black SUV rolled forward, as if every second had been precisely measured. Not fast, not frantic, but certain. The people nearby began to turn. Some eyes shifted from the gun to the car pulling in. Brenner hadn't turned yet, but what was arriving wasn't a witness. It was someone who wouldn't ask what happened, but would say, "Put the gun down, now." And this time, the silence wouldn't belong to the one with the gun pointed at him, but to the one forced to face the truth. The engine wasn't loud, but steady, like a deliberate breath. The sleek black SUV slowly entered a scene suffocating under the aim of a young officer's gun. No siren, no flashing lights, no markings to signal it belonged to law enforcement. But that was exactly why its arrival drew even more attention. It stopped, right at the edge of the street, precisely, leaving no extra space, missing not a beat. It stopped like the driver already knew the exact point where time would break and truth would step in. Brenner didn't turn around immediately. He didn't register the car. His full attention stayed locked on the woman before him, Dana Monroe, her hands raised, not out of fear, but because she understood there was no safer way to stay alive when facing a barrel loaded with bias. But somewhere deep in his throat, something shifted. Not words, a kind of dryness, as if his body had sensed something misaligned with his original plan, as if a system, once smoothly fueled by force, had just been interrupted by a foreign signal. The sound of the car door opening was soft, with no spring clicks or feet slamming the pavement. No one shouted to "drop the weapon." No one threw themselves in front of a bullet like in the movies. Just a door easing open, no more than necessary, then closing again, just as gently, as if careful not to rupture the tension already strung tight as wire. A man stepped out, no uniform, no badge, nameplate, or radio gear. He wore a charcoal gray suit, polished black shoes, and a neatly fixed tie. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes neither scanning nor seething. He didn't approach like an enraged husband, nor did he carry himself like a shocked bystander. He moved forward like someone who had known all along what was happening and had come ready to step into the exact frame that history would remember. Marcus Monroe didn't need to look around. He didn't check the scene, didn't assess who was filming, didn't seek the right angle for a camera. He only needed one glance at Brenner from behind to understand exactly what that stance meant. Both hands on a gun, eyes locked, and that gun pointed at the woman he loved, whom he knew was more than a victim. She was a symbol, someone who knew when to speak and when to stay silent so that the truth could speak for itself. He walked slowly, but without hesitation. Each step is a declaration. I'm not here to ask questions. I'm here to end this. The people nearby, once just passers-by, camera holders, bystanders, suddenly became still, as if some instinct inside them had just said, "This scene is about to become something else entirely." Dana hadn't moved. She had seen him the moment the car door opened. She didn't call his name, didn't shift, just tilted her head slightly, not to seek help, not to plead, but to acknowledge something simple and weighty. He was here, and she was no longer alone. Marcus stopped less than 3 meters from Brenner. The distance posed no physical threat, but it was close enough to create the perfect disturbance field for the confidence of anyone holding a gun. No one walks that close to an armed officer without backup, unless that person knows for certain that their power doesn't lie in a holster, but in the truth that the gun can't touch. Marcus didn't raise his hands. He didn't flash a badge, didn't state a title, didn't cite any laws. He didn't plead or yell like a frantic husband. He gave Brenner nothing to react to, nothing to trigger a defensive response. Only his eyes, a firm, cold, steady gaze, as if he was seeing through the man in front of him, to the long string of missteps being repeated once again. The words that followed weren't loud. They didn't carry force by volume, but carried the full weight of a truth Brenner had never been forced to face. Do you even know who she is? In any ordinary context, the question might have sounded like a gentle reminder, but here, it was a wrench thrown into the entire interpretive framework. It demanded no explanation, it needed no evidence. It simply existed and forced the listener into silent self-confrontation. Brenner didn't answer, not because he didn't hear it, but because there was nothing he could say. He looked at Dana, then back at Marcus, then down at the gun, still in his hand. No one told him to lower it, but his grip had already started to fade. The bystanders didn't need context. They didn't have to understand the relationship between the man who had stepped out of the car and the woman standing with her hand raised in the street. But they knew one thing for sure. Anyone who could bring a police officer in full situation control mode to a complete halt with a single sentence was not just an ordinary citizen. A young girl filming with her phone muttered, "Who even is that guy? Is he her husband? What did he say to make that cop freeze like that?" No one answered. No one needed to, because the silence that followed said more than any explanation ever could. It said that real power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up. Dana said nothing. She didn't move either. But from the moment Marcus stepped forward, the look on her face shifted, not defensive anymore, but resolute. No belief in a man who'd come to rescue her, belief in the truth, that wrongdoing always hesitates when it finally faces the right person. Marcus didn't need to look intimidating. He didn't need to declare who he was, because the moment that question left his lips, the system, built on the reflexes of simple authority, short-circuited. And from that moment on, it was no longer Dana who had to prove who she was. It was Brenner, and those like him, who had to ask themselves, who did I just point my weapon at? And who saw it happen? The leather notebook slipped from Dana's hand in the instant she raised her arms by reflex, a move born of survival. It hit the cement ground without a loud sound, just a soft touch against the pavement. In a moment where every eye was locked on the invisible line between a drawn gun and a woman with her hands raised, something that small was easy to miss. But Marcus didn't miss it. He had seen it the moment he stepped forward. What had fallen wasn't an accessory, nor a stray note. It was something he understood the weight of, not in material value, but in its power to end any debate. It was identity, encoded into symbols, paper, and emblems, and it wasn't for those who judge people by the surface. He bent down, not hurried. His motion wasn't theatrical, but neither was it careless. It was the kind of movement made by someone who had worked in a world where every detail carried weight. He picked the notebook up between two fingers, without a sound, without glancing around. Then he opened the leather cover as if performing a ritual he knew we won one. He had done many times before, those who believed they held the upper hand, but this time he needed no introduction. He let the document speak for itself. Inside was a hard, metallic gray ID card, laser-edged, lined with faint holographic seals. In the top left corner sat a pentagon emblem, one that appears only on internal credentials of the U.S. Department of Defense. Below it, printed in clean serif font, Department of Strategic Security, Level 4 clearance, Internal Liaison Division. Beneath that, an identification code, digital signature, and color-shifting ink stamp. The reverse side bore Dana's photo, no makeup, no edits, but the same gaze, staring directly into the lens, identical to the one she had fixed on the gun moments before. No explanation was needed. Anyone with even a basic understanding of domestic security, or who had simply read a military brief, knew one thing for sure: this couldn't be faked. And the person holding it was no ordinary civilian. Marcus didn't lift the badge high to intimidate. He didn't just raise his chin in defiance or raise an arrogant brow. He simply tilted the notebook slightly to one side, letting the midday light catch the card's metal surface and reflect it onto the pavement, just enough for the man in front of him to see. No need to say, "Do you know who this is?" No need to stress, "You're pointing a gun at her." The card stayed open, its cold silver gleam heavier than any courtroom indictment. The entire scene froze, as if the signal carried a weight no one dared ignore. Marcus didn't have to take another step. Brenner didn't need to look long. Every eye in that moment, whether behind a camera, holding a leash, or passing by, had seen it. And what they saw wasn't just a badge. They saw a system ensnaring itself in the consequences of its own reckless pattern. No alarms went off, but from this moment, the entire conversation shifted, from one of control to one of reckoning, and the officer, still gripping his weapon, was no longer an agent of authority, but a man clinging to the illusion that he still had the power to decide. The young woman standing near the bus stop hadn't taken her eyes off the strange standoff unfolding in the middle of the street. At first, she started filming out of instinct, just like all those meaningless clips she'd scrolled past online. A cop talking to a person of color, a few tense words exchanged, then everyone walks away. But when the officer drew his gun, her heart skipped. She held her phone at chest level, arms braced to stop any shaking, trying not to breathe too hard so the wind wouldn't drown out the sound. But when Marcus bent down to pick up the notebook, something in her shifted. She didn't need to know who he was, but she knew this was no longer just another incident video. Her finger moved instinctively to the zoom button. The lens trembled slightly, blurred for a second, then refocused just as the edge of the leather cover flipped open. Sunlight slanted across the dark leather, catching the silver emblem. So sharp, it felt cold. She didn't understand exactly what it was, but it wasn't a driver's license, not a bank card, not a state ID. What appeared wasn't meant for ordinary people. She saw a pentagon shape. She saw small embossed text, thick and official, and she saw the face on the ID. The same woman who had just stood in silence with her hand raised, matching perfectly, undeniably. The video had no shouting. No one screamed, no insults, just the sound of wind cutting through the alley, the faint knock of heels on a step, wrapping paper fluttering in the breeze, and a sharp gasp from someone unseen in the background. But the image was as clear as midday light. A man in a suit holding a badge of unquestionable authority, and a police officer, gun still in hand, suddenly freezing. No one gave him orders. No one told him to lower the weapon, but the air around him tightened like a wordless trap. Every whisper, every tiny reaction from the Cur WD vanished. A crying child inside the cafe across the street fell silent. A woman who had just raised her phone stopped mid-motion and lowered it. Everyone understood. What had just been revealed couldn't be ignored. It couldn't be deleted, and it definitely couldn't be twisted. Brenner looked at the badge. His eyes moved, but more slowly than before, as if each letter he saw was striking the last conscious part of his brain, the part that still remembered what was taught in the final training session. Never point a gun at something you don't fully understand. But it was too late now. His hand had lost its grip. He didn't lower the gun, but no one felt it carried any weight anymore. It looked more like a stain than a weapon. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. Brenner said nothing, but the veins rising on his neck showed. He knew. He hadn't just aimed a gun at an individual. He'd aimed it at a branch of power, one his system was built to obey, not control. And the worst part was, everyone had seen it. No one needed to say, It's been recorded. No one needed to warn. It's going online because it was already captured. And what had been captured wasn't just an event. It was a turning point, a moment when the system, which thought it was in control, began to suffocate under the truth now exposed through a lens. The young woman wasn't a journalist. She wasn't a human rights activist, just an ordinary person who happened to be in the right place at the exact moment a gun was drawn. When Officer Chad Brenner pointed a firearm at an unarmed black woman in the middle of the street, her hands shook, but her finger never left the live stream button. No clickbait title, no commentary. The footage started simply. A shaky frame, beginning at the officer's waist, slowly tilting up to the barrel, and finally to the woman's face, still arms raised slowly. No one screamed, no one collapsed, but that silence became a slap to every excuse ever used to cover up violence before. Within 3 hours of the live broadcast, the video had been shared over 2,000 times by small accounts, Black community groups, law student organizations, and independent news outlets. What made the clip go viral wasn't camera work, it was the undeniable contrast in every frame. A woman who did nothing wrong, didn't raise her voice, didn't run, yet was treated as a threat. And then, just minutes later, a man in a suit appeared. He didn't shout, didn't shove, he simply stood and asked, "Do you know who she is?" And that was when the power dynamic shifted, not through violence, but through the system's fear of true authority. Authority that doesn't need a gun to make the one holding it hesitate. In discussion groups, the first question was, who is that man? But soon, a deeper question followed. Who is she? And from the moment the federal ID glinted in the sunlight, everyone understood. This wasn't just a gun drawn. It was a misstep into the domain of high-level oversight, and this time it had been caught on camera. Comments poured in. What if she didn't have that badge? How many videos missed this exact moment? I saw something like this once, but no one was filming. What no one expected was that the young woman didn't stop at filming. After the incident, she began clipping the footage, calling on others to help identify the people involved, and launched a new channel to archive similar encounters. No training, no funding. But she knew one thing. This time, she wasn't just a bystander. She didn't need to condemn anyone. She just needed to keep the footage intact, so no one could blur out what happened in front of dozens of witnesses, when only one person had the courage to hold up a phone and not look away. 3 hours after the incident, hashtags began to spread across platforms. If she was me. No media team, no polished campaign, just a raw video, enough to make millions realize they'd been silent for too long. And this time, silence was no longer an option. Those who once thought of themselves as just passing by had stopped, no longer just to film, but to ask, who will be next if no one dares to record again? From that day forward, in Charleston, when an officer steps out of a patrol car, more phones are raised, not to provoke, but to remind. No one is invisible anymore, and no one gets to act like no one is watching. Less than 12 hours after the clip shook social media, the woman's true identity was uncovered by internet users. Dana Monroe, a name once familiar within federal legal circles, now thrust into the public spotlight in an entirely different way. No one had expected that the woman held at gunpoint on a city street, assumed to be just another unfortunate civilian shot, had once been the lead prosecutor in one of the largest human rights investigations involving the civil detention system in the past decade. A data-sleuthing Twitter account started the thread with, "I think I've seen this face before," in a 2016 federal investigative report. Just minutes later, a screenshot of Dana Monroe's old LinkedIn profile was being widely shared. That profile listed her as lead federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she was involved in witness protection and legal action against civil rights violations in privately operated detention centers. She left the position in early 2019, after concluding a series of high-profile cases, none of which ever made mainstream headlines. Some commenters recalled reading her name in international human rights reports, but had never seen her face. Now, they had not gone through a conference portrait or policy headline, but through a life-or-death moment streamed online. Things erupted when an anonymous account with a bald eagle avatar and the handle claiming to be a former internal auditor unexpectedly released a 47-page PDF. The document was said to be an excerpt from internal investigative files of the U.S. Civil Detention Oversight Board, the body that monitors federal civil detention facilities. On the second page, Dana Monroe's name appeared, clearly listed as the lead federal prosecutor for Case 2016-71A, Southgate Holding Facility. For those in the field, Southgate was no obscure name. It was a civil detention center on the southern outskirts, long accused of harsh conditions, unchecked punitive practices, and shadowy ties to private contractors in healthcare and security. The 2016 investigation was considered the first time a privatized facility had been publicly exposed, and the person responsible for escalating it from a state-level probe to a federal case was Dana. On the official interagency investigation request, sealed with a red stamp, the signature at the bottom read, D. Monroe. One section of the PDF listed the confirmed violations that led to Southgate's closure in 2018. Use of tear gas in the medical wing, extended illegal detention periods, payroll fraud, and, most notably, a series of verified complaints from Latinx detainees alleging organized assaults by an internal security group. Each allegation was marked verified. Dana was the one who ordered the records sealed to protect witnesses, resulting in the reassignment, suspension, or dismissal of numerous staff members. Once this information surfaced across social media, it didn't just fuel the outrage already burning. It forced thousands to ask a new question. If she was the one who exposed a corrupt system, what led to a gun being pointed at her head in broad daylight? And more urgently, who is working to make sure that moment disappears? A sharp-owned social media user uncovered another detail from an old personnel file. Among the list of employees terminated at the Southgate Holding Facility in 2017 was the name Chad Brenna, then only a Level 2 security guard, but directly involved in an incident of improper pepper spray use inside the medical ward. According to the released documents, Brenner had discharged a canister inside an isolation zone without T-clear cause, resulting in 2 injuries and 1 medic being hospitalized. The incident was initially covered up internally by facility management, labeled a false alarm, and omitted from the official report. But during a broader investigation triggered by the Department of Justice, internal logs retrieved from security cameras were recovered and submitted in an escalation petition. That petition bore a federal seal, and the final signature was Dana Monroe's. Once this detail resurfaced, the word coincidence lost all meaning. A man previously investigated for civil rights violations, dismissed from his post by the very woman he later pointed a gun at in the middle of the street, had somehow been granted the authority to enforce the law again, and had used that power on the exact person who had once pushed him out of the system. There was no scripted narrative for something like this, but past and present collided like 2 blades, and the blood drawn was no longer metaphorical. The entire situation could no longer be written off as a moment of occupational reflex. It was the return of an old grudge, this time with a weapon, a camera, and millions of witnesses. Public response began to shift. Accounts that had instinctively defended Brenner, echoing the usual refrains like "cops have to be cautious," "no one knew what she might do," started to go silent or walk back their comments. Some began reposting articles about professional ethics and the dangers of allowing individuals with a record of violence to carry guns and wear uniforms. The debate no longer revolved around, "Did she do anything wrong?" but had shifted entirely to, "Why is this person still in law enforcement?" A larger question started forming across platforms. If there hadn't been a live stream, what would have happened? How many similar incidents have been rewritten in the language of internal reports, or never written down at all, people began collecting other examples. Officials, journalists, activists pulled over, questioned, or threatened, not for wrongdoing, but for once holding a system accountable that never liked being named. Incidents once dismissed as isolated misconduct were now being threaded into a pattern. The system does not forget those who once forced it to change. And sometimes it comes back, not to ask why, but to remind you who gets to act without explanation. Within a single day, the hashtag #BrennerNewer surpassed 600,000 mentions. No one still believed this was a case of drawing a weapon out of reasonable suspicion, because now the man with the gun wasn't anonymous. The woman he aimed at wasn't an unlucky stranger, and the video didn't just document an act. It captured the moment an old bureaucratic grudge turned into a modern-day threat, loaded and pointed. While all attention was focused on Dana Monroe, the woman who had a gun pointed at her head in broad daylight, a quieter question began spreading across social media. Who is the man in the gray suit? Not because he shouted, not because he threatened, but because he was the only person who made an armed officer lower his weapon, not by command, but by hesitation. A man who didn't need to rush, didn't need to shout his title, yet brought an entire scene to a standstill. A man not in uniform, yet who walked as if the whole system answered to where he stood. Within hours, users traced the original footage, analyzed frame by frame, and cross-referenced public security symposiums. Then a clip resurfaced from a 2022 strategic conference. A man speaking in a small auditorium, voice low and steady, eyes unwavering, introduced as Marcus D. Monroe, Senior Strategic Advisor at the U.S. Department of Defense. From there, archived records began to emerge. According to data from an unofficial military forum, Marcus had served 12 years with the U.S. Strategic Response Command, a unit rarely mentioned in the press, tasked with entering high-risk zones prone to large-scale civil unrest, including situations involving misconduct by local law enforcement. Marcus wasn't just a field officer. He was part of the team that helped design and shape the National Response Advisory Unit, a specialized group created after a wave of civil incidents post-2015, charged with assessing and responding to threats beyond the scope of traditional policing. A leaked 2021 report noted Marcus as one of the first to propose integrating behavioral data from local police departments with a federal interagency oversight system, enabling the Department of Justice to flag officers with patterns of excessive force or repeat misconduct. By 2020, after transitioning to an advisory role, Marcus was appointed Liaison Authority, a position granting him direct access between law enforcement agencies and strategic response teams. Put simply, he could access any internal law enforcement record at any level without waiting on a court order. This is why, in that moment, with Brenner still gripping his gun, Marcus didn't need to raise his voice or flash credentials. A single glance, a single question, "Do you know who she is?" was enough to stop everything. Because if he wanted, every one of Brenner's actions, every shift report, every disciplinary note could be retrieved within 24 hours, bypassing all local barriers. Marcus's presence it was the arrival of a higher order system, quiet enough not to announce itself, but powerful enough to force the entire chain of command to pause and look inward. The truth is, Marcus didn't need authority to enter the scene. He was the reason the authority could not be ignored, and when someone like him is present, no misstep, intentional or not, can remain hidden. Because this time, the person being held at gunpoint was not alone, and the man beside her was someone the system could not bury behind any closed file. What made the entire system go cold wasn't Marcus Monroe's voice. It was the way he didn't have to raise it. In the moment Officer Brenner still held a gun to his wife, Marcus asked just one question. "Do you know who she is?" The question carried no threat. No volume, no invocation of rank or privilege, and yet behind it stood a tier of authority so formidable that, had the uniformed officers present known, It would have ended the situation before another second passed. The truth was, Brenner might not have known at that moment, but millions of people would soon learn. Marcus D. Monroe wasn't just a husband who showed up in time. He held Tier 4 strategic clearance, one of the highest levels of access granted by the Department of Defense to strategic personnel in the Interagency Advisory Corps. These individuals don't fight on the front lines, but they have the power to assess and intervene in law enforcement operations when structural misconduct is suspected. In plain terms, he didn't need permission to investigate a police officer. He only needed a reason. With this clearance, Marcus could access the behavioral records of any law enforcement officer, including internal reports, dismissed complaints, internal disciplinary notes, and sealed files classified under risk of recurring misconduct. More than that, if Marcus identified a pattern of ongoing abuse of power, he could trigger an independent audit, one that required no approval from the local precinct. The report would go directly to the Department of Justice and the Law Enforcement Oversight Unit at the Pentagon. That's why Marcus didn't have to flash a badge, didn't have to state his title, didn't have to declare anything. He just had to show up. And the way he stepped forward, unflinching, then asked a single, sharp question was enough for everyone around to understand. If a violation occurred, they wouldn't be able to wrap it up in a revised report. They were standing before a living witness, not just any witness, but a built-in node of the very system designed to monitor them. Brenner's decision to draw his weapon could, at first, have been labeled a professional reflex. But once Marcus's identity was confirmed, it ceased to be a personal act. It became a breach, one that collided directly with the boundaries of strategic security. And the danger for Brenner wasn't just disciplinary action. It was that every action he'd taken in the past could now be pulled from the database, placed under scrutiny, line by line, faster than any internal hearing ever convened. Marcus didn't need to issue a warning, didn't need to threaten, but everyone in the machine around him, from the person recording the clip to the Charleston Police Department to the city's legal counsel, understood one thing with crystal clarity. When someone like Marcus had witnessed something firsthand, without intermediaries, no denial afterward would hold weight. The system had no exit strategy, and any report written later, no matter how carefully crafted, would be measured against the silence he held when the weapon was finally lowered. Because once the truth has entered the line of sight of someone with the authority to access the system's core, it can no longer be buried. It will be activated, and it will spread. The Charleston Police Department headquarters lit up unusually around 3 a.m., earlier than any regular shift, with no internal announcements issued, no sirens, no reporters outside, no calls from media outlets. But the third floor of the main building was sealed off, marked with a sign, "Restricted briefing, executive level only." This wasn't a scheduled meeting, nor was it a routine response. This was an emergency, triggered by pressure that could shake the entire institution. The video showing the standoff between Officer Chad Brenner and the man in the gray suit, Marcus Monroe, had reached over 3.2 million views in less than 8 hours. National media were now calling the incident a structurally significant law enforcement failure. The room was silent, broken only by the clatter of keyboards. On the large screen was a live feed of social media platforms, with real-time comments, hashtags, and highlighted notes from media analysts. Brenner's face appeared in a smaller frame, facing a woman with raised hands, and behind her, Marcus was approaching. Several high-ranking officials sat frozen. They understood this was no longer about an officer's judgment. This was a political fissure that could trigger a system-wide audit. The head of External Affairs was the first to speak, without delay. "I recommend Officer Chad Brenner be placed on paid administrative leave for 72 hours, pending internal investigation." No one interrupted. No one objected outright, but glances began to cross the table, each one waiting for someone else to define just how deep the damage might go. The next to speak was the representative from Behavioral Oversight, her voice even and weary, as if she already sensed where the wind was blowing. "He didn't technically violate firearm protocol, but drawing a gun on someone holding a federal strategic clearance badge, That's a risk we can no longer shield. No one nodded, but no one argued. Internally, each person was racing through crisis scenarios, media fallout, liability mapping, the possibility of federal litigation. Marcus Monroe wasn't just a private citizen. He was a node in the National Law Enforcement Behavior Monitoring Network. One report from him, filed with the right clearance, could bring a federal investigative unit to Charleston without advance notice. The air in the room began to shift. This wasn't about disciplining one reckless officer. This was about the survival of an entire department, now facing the risk of exposing a trail of internal approvals if Brenner's past were reopened. Eyes drifted toward the tables for HR and internal affairs, as if waiting for the larger question, who approved Brenner's reinstatement after his dismissal from Southgate detention? And if that question went public, who would be the first to answer? Everyone in the room understood. If they moved too slowly on Brenner, public pressure could push the system over the edge. But if they moved too fast, skipping the process, failing to protect others entangled in the chain, collapse could begin from within. The meeting reached a fragile balance between media crisis suppression and containment of internal procedural exposure. And in the quietest hours of that morning, even the most loyal defenders of the system began to realize, this time, no one was leaving the room without getting dust on their hands. As the meeting neared a vote, when the room had mostly leaned toward temporarily suspending Brenner, a gesture meant to placate public outrage before the story spilled onto national news, a deep voice cut through, firm but not loud. Henry Stokes, Deputy Director of Internal Affairs. He didn't interrupt anyone. He simply waited for the right pause, then asked the one question no one in the room wanted to hear. If we suspend Brenner immediately, we're admitting he was in the wrong. And if he was wrong, then who signed off on bringing him back to the force last year? The question hit the room like a chisel striking a long-standing fracture. No one answered. But everyone knew Stokes had been the one to reinstate Brenner's file, despite existing documentation of his emotional control issues and a prior procedural breach during his time as a guard at Southgate. At the time, the decision had been internally marked as reappointment reviewed under domestic security agreement, a bureaucratic euphemism for back-channel deals between private security contractors and department heads. No one had said it out loud, but everyone in that room understood. If Brenner was suspended for misconduct, accountability wouldn't stop with him. It would rise, and Stokes was at the center of that chain. Calm but deliberate, Stokes proposed an alternative. Not suspension, no public disclosure, no formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, he suggested transferring Brenner to an administrative role for 30 days, unannounced while waiting for any potential federal review. He called it a way to cool the media pressure, to deflect attention, to avoid letting the situation explode into a politically charged manhunt. A few heads nodded, not because they believed it was the right call, but because they understood. Stokes wasn't speaking just for Brenner, he was speaking for the entire machinery they were part of. But the problem, and what made his proposal immediately obsolete, was that this time, the story was no longer under Charleston's control. Public outrage had spilled past city limits. The hashtag Brenner knew her was now being cited by national news anchors. Independent watchdog organizations had filed formal requests for full access to Brenner's service records. And most critically, Marcus Monroe's name had begun appearing in briefing memos on federal tier-level personnel present at active law enforcement scenes. Once that information was verified, and if Charleston failed to act within the next 24 hours, the thing facing suspension wouldn't be a single officer. It would be the entire belief that the system could still hold itself accountable. The room fell quiet again. Those who had thought themselves insulated, discreet enough to stay outside this storm, were beginning to realize that silence was no longer neutral. Silence would now be read as complicity. Stokes kept his face impassive, but his eyes swept across a room no longer on solid ground. He was holding tight to a leaking valve, but everyone knew if the cap blew off, the flood wouldn't just spill. It would take down anyone who thought they weren't part of it. While the internal investigation remained unfinished and public outrage still burned over the viral videos of the confrontation between Chad Brenner and Dana Monroe, a bombshell dropped, one no one saw coming. A series of internal emails was leaked from the Charleston Police Department's servers. The sender was anonymous, but independent legal experts verified the attached digital signature as authentic, matching the department's administrative security protocols. The emails didn't shout. They carried no subject lines like racial strategy or bias control, but their content, written in carefully bureaucratic language, shattered the idea that Brenner's actions were somehow incidental. Among dozens of files, the most discussed was an email from Lieutenant Colonel Gregory M. Shaw, commander of Charleston's East Division, sent to 6 patrol supervisors in December of the previous year. The subject: preventive behavioral focus, high-risk retail zones. The message was short. It offered no explicit instructions, yet its clipped, coded language revealed a chillingly deliberate mindset. Shaw wrote, "We must remain alert to atypical behavior, individuals not residing in the area, exhibiting signs of spending beyond social norms, particularly people of color wearing luxury accessories or handbags. This is how financial crime in disguise tests our control response. Act decisively if needed. No mention of weapons, no call to draw firearms, but within the phrases spending beyond social norms and act decisively, an entire world of bias had been quietly embedded and passed off as operational strategy. What made this email especially damning was the inclusion of Chad Brenner in the CC field. Alongside a brief note, "This is the newly reassigned team. Add to priority behavioral alert list." What did that mean? It meant Brenner, just weeks after being reinstated from a prior role as a private security guard, was directly funneled into a framework of coded surveillance thinking. So when he saw Dana Monroe standing on a city street, wearing a Chanel crossbody and holding a designer shopping bag, his reaction wasn't isolated instinct. It was the outcome of policy, triggered by a directive, cloaked as a strategy to prevent disguised financial crimes. No one inside the department raised objections when the email was first sent. Not a single reply flagged a concern. No supervisor questioned what spending beyond social norms actually meant, or how it was defined. The message was received, read, understood, and operations continued, and that exposed a stark truth. Brenner's case wasn't an outlier. It was a product. Dana Monroe wasn't stopped because she was suspicious. She was stopped because she didn't fit the silently coded model of acceptable behavior. She was a black woman, standing in a conservative neighborhood, carrying luxury goods. 3 traits sufficient to trigger a policy-driven response. No one told Brenner to draw his weapon, but he had been taught to suspect. And this email was the paper trail of that lesson. The leak of internal email threads didn't just shake public opinion, it collapsed the entire defensive narrative that the Charleston Police Department and its defenders had clung to. The act of a police officer pulling a gun on an unarmed woman in broad daylight, already beyond acceptable limits, could no longer be framed as an individual overreaction. It wasn't a deviation from protocol, it was the direct result of a silent chain of decision-making, in which bias had been rationalized through administrative language and discrimination rewritten with technical phrases like spending beyond social norms or proactive behavioral containment. When the image of Dana Monroe, a black woman dressed neatly, carrying a Chanel purse and a birthday gift for her husband, was placed next to the line from the leaked email, "People of color with luxury accessories should be dealt with decisively if necessary," it became impossible to call her a random victim. She was anticipated, profiled, and categorized into a model that required control. Not because her behavior was suspicious, but because her presence disrupted a control model the system was accustomed to. A black individual, educated, poised, autonomous, powerful, daring to appear in a space not meant for them. Her Chanel bag ceased to be a fashion detail. It became a misread symbol, punished as if she had stepped outside the role the system had quietly assigned her. What made it even more chilling was the silent agreement from everyone on the email chain. 6 patrol supervisors, 3 behavioral oversight leads, and a string of administrative personnel were all on the distribution list. Not one replied. Not one questioned how spending beyond social norms was being defined. No one brought up legality, anti-discrimination standards, or civil rights. All received, read, understood, and continued their work. Discrimination didn't need to shout. It only needed to be typed in bold under the heading Behavioral Containment Strategy. And in that context, their silence was no longer passive. It was an active gesture of complicity. Now, with the video spreading across all platforms, with the public aware of the names tied to the chain, that silence could no longer be buried in internal-only folders. The quiet nods that once passed policy along have become ink stains on the face of public trust, stains that cannot be scrubbed clean by press conferences or phrases like, "We are reviewing our procedures," because now the public sees the response of one man. Chad Brenner was the final product of a system that ran smoothly, quietly, and with precision. And when a system trains someone to respond like that, it's the system that must be held accountable, not just for failing to stop it, but for never intending to. That morning, the sky over Charleston was a soft gray, no rain, but enough wind to make the flags outside City Hall tremble. Inside the adjacent community hall, Dana Monroe arrived on time. No entourage, no advance notice, no stage draped with logos from any organization. She chose to stand alone, in a gray suit with no flashy branding, but tailored, with precision down to the shoulder seam. The wooden podium before her was low, chipped at one corner, not the kind used by politicians, but the kind for ordinary people saying extraordinary things. On the sign in front of her, the only bolded line didn't list a title. It read, "The woman who had a gun pointed at her for carrying the wrong color purse." There was no introduction, no moderator, just her and a ring of folding chairs with a handful of local reporters, along with over 12,000 people watching via live stream. No one called it a press conference. No one dared call her a victim. Dana didn't open by talking about herself. She didn't say Chad Brenner's name, didn't describe the moment the gun was drawn, didn't speak of pounding hearts or held breath. She wasn't there to be pitied. She wasn't there to reclaim personal justice. She came to question not the officer, but the system that convinced him he had the right to act as he did. Her eyes scanned the front row, where a few city officials sat, 2 in dark suits, one wearing a Justice Council badge. She spoke clearly, firmly. "I'm not here to recount, because if you need me to tell it, that means you never really saw it. And if you already saw it, then we need to be talking about something else." The room went still. No chairs were shifted. No phones buzzed. Dana paused, letting the words settle before continuing, her voice low, not loud, but sharply edged. "If I didn't have a strategic clearance card, if the man in the suit hadn't stepped out of the SUV, if no camera had been rolling, would I still be standing here this morning?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered. Everyone in the room already knew, and because they knew, no one dared speak. It wasn't a moral question, it was a systemic one, a test not of belief, but of infrastructure. Is justice only acknowledged when the harmed carry enough weight to make others hesitate? Does justice require badges and cameras to be permitted at all? She wasn't angry, but her gaze held the depth of someone who's reviewed hundreds of internal reports, someone who's sat across from dozens of officers before federal oversight boards. Her voice didn't rise and fall like a speech. It moved with the rhythm of files closed with no accountability. And this time, she wasn't seated behind an investigative panel. She stood in the heart of a city that had long protected people like Brenner and demanded the truth about each person watching. What do you see when you're no longer allowed to pretend you're blind? The conversation had only just begun, but from her very first words, Dana shifted the narrative from a personal incident to a structural reckoning. She didn't need to be pitied. She needed just one question to force a city to ask itself whether it still deserved to be called just. For the full 40 minutes of the forum, Dana Monroe barely changed her expression. She never said Brenner's name. She didn't single out anyone. She didn't mention Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Shaw, the one accused of authoring the internal email that called for handling people of color with luxury items. No one was dragged out as a scapegoat, because Dana wasn't there for someone to take the fall. She wanted the entire mechanism to look at itself in the mirror. Every time she lifted her eyes from the document, the air in the room tightened. Not from anger, but from the weight of it all. She read each line as if reciting a death toll, flat, steady, unadorned. Non-resident individuals of color carrying luxury accessories are indicators requiring surveillance. Delayed response from units may result in loss of control over high-value zones. Immediate intervention not to be ruled out in unclear situations. She looked up. Not a single eye dared to meet hers. Then she said, "If this is what you call behavioral policy, then the question isn't why someone had a gun pointed at them. It's why so many still believe they have the right to point it out." There was no applause, no reaction, because everyone knew this wasn't a speech. It was a public reckoning for a city that had, for far too long, accepted the wrong decisions, as long as they didn't happen on camera. Dana didn't need to shout to make waves. She didn't need to cry to be believed. Her language wasn't meant to stir conscience. It was meant to demolish the excuse of, "I didn't know," that the system had leaned on for decades. In every sentence, Dana didn't speak of pain. She spoke of rights, protocol, administrative ethics, and shared responsibility. She peeled back the layers. Who signed the directives? Who received the emails and said nothing? Who stayed silent because they didn't want to stir conflict? She didn't need to deliver a verdict. She simply needed everyone in that room to realize that their silence hadn't come from ignorance, but from a habit of benefiting from not speaking up. And that's why the forum became a turning point, not for its tears, but because for the first time, someone stood in front of the city and said, "I watched you hide your hands," while blood was already on the floor. When the talk ended, she didn't bow. She didn't thank the moderator. She didn't step down like a guest speaker. She simply closed her folder, picked up her pen, and stood still for 3 seconds. No reporters asked follow-up questions. No one dared say there are many sides to this issue. She didn't look into the cameras. She looked directly at the men in suits seated along the edges and said, every word deliberate, "I don't need your defense. I need you to answer the right question. Not for me, for the ones without a mic, without a badge, who are still being stopped every day, just for entering the right neighborhood with the wrong skin." Then she walked off the stage without an escort, but behind her, the silence no longer felt calm. It felt like something was about to break, because this time, justice didn't wait for the gun to fire. Justice spoke first, and everyone heard it. Following Dana Monroe's powerful public address, the media stopped behaving like passive recorders of events. They shifted roles, from reporters to investigators. Within 2 days, NBC dispatched a dedicated reporting team to Charleston, not just to cover the story, but to reconstruct the full timeline, from the moment Dana stepped out of the boutique to when the gun was finally lowered at the site of Marcus Monroe. The Root, known for its focus on racial justice, devoted its weekend edition to analyzing the trend of appearance-based behavioral profiling by law enforcement toward black citizens, especially when they appear in spaces society subconsciously deems not theirs. The Washington Post went further. Bypassing commentary and social media speculation, they filed a FOIA request with the Department of Justice to obtain Charleston PD's full patrol records, with one goal in mind: to determine whether Dana Monroe's case was truly as isolated as the department claimed. From early articles to in-depth reports, one question began to dominate every headline. Is this a one-off incident or the only visible tip of a nameless policy? Reporters didn't stop at the viral video. They went deeper, speaking to residents in the neighborhood who had stayed silent for years, some who witnessed the event, but hadn't spoken up because nothing serious happened. Attorneys who had represented victims whose cases never made it to court for lack of documentation. These voices were now being brought together, not to retell the story, but to answer a larger question. How many times had something like this happened when no Marcus Monroe stepped in, when no camera caught it, when was no name big enough to force the system to listen? For the first time in years, the media acted as a true watchdog, not for Dana, but for the countless unknown Danas who quietly fade after every unjustified traffic stop. One long-form article from The Root, shared over 300,000 times, hit the system's most vulnerable nerve. If the system needs a federal badge to distinguish suspect from victim, then it's not the citizens who need response training. It's the entire force that needs retraining in rights. This conclusion wasn't just quoted by dozens of outlets, it opened a primetime MSNBC segment, marking a shift in national tone, from empathy for the victim to scrutiny of the mechanism. It was no longer about a woman held at gunpoint. It was about a city too accustomed to excusing the inexcusable, so long as the person harmed couldn't fight back. At the same time, across platforms, media analysts began referring to the phenomenon as the reverse Tanger effect of the silent system. When an incident expected to vanish instead unlocks scrutiny of an entire framework, no longer about hashtags, no longer about viral outrage. This time, the media came armed with documents, verified leaks, and official records, and instead of reporting the pursuit of justice, they made demands. If Charleston PD wanted to continue operating with public trust, it would have to answer for every case, every ignored complaint, every policy tucked away in footnotes. Because this time, journalists weren't waiting for justice to trickle down, they were dragging it into the light themselves. The central question raised by reporters after the Dana Monroe incident, was this an outlier or a model, didn't take long to find its answer. In a special investigative report published by Washington Post Digital, journalists accessed over 200 pages of internal documentation obtained through a FOIA request through the Charleston PD. Through patrol logs, dispatch journals, and internal email threads, they compiled a list of proactive interventions over the past 2 years. The result didn't spark shock, it sent a chill. 8 cases with eerily similar patterns, all targeting black citizens, all taking place in mid to upper income retail areas, and all ending without accountability. 4 had no cameras. 2 were formally complained about but dismissed due to lack of verifiable evidence. 1 stood out, a Nigerian doctor visiting for a statewide medical conference, detained for 18 minutes for showing non-compliant behavior during an administrative check. He left the U.S. shortly after, filing no report. Only 1 case, Dana Monroe's, met 3 unprecedented criteria. It was caught on video, involved someone with enough institutional stature to prevent a cover-up, and had a voice powerful enough to make millions listen. From that data, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't exactly a policy, but the repetition was too consistent to be a coincidence. Locations of incidents. Residential neighborhoods with middle-class income or higher, where residents were familiar with one another and often suspicious of strangers who looked different. Subjects stopped, people of color, well-dressed, carrying designer bags or driving luxury cars. In other words, individuals who didn't fit the default image of a local resident. Justifications for intervention. In almost no case was there a clear violation reported. Instead, vague phrases were used repeatedly. Ambiguous behavior, excessive defensive posture, or non-compliant attitude during verification procedures. On paper, none of these phrases explicitly indicated bias, but when paired with skin color, location, and resulting consequences, they formed a systemic operating formula for discrimination, one so refined it didn't need to be spoken out loud. The most dangerous aspect of this model wasn't that it was commanded. It wasn't that it didn't need to be. There were no explicit orders, no written policy on differential treatment, and yet patrol officers understood what to do when they saw a black woman outside a luxury boutique holding an expensive bag. Surveillance teams knew when to stop a car and when to let it go. Internal affairs departments knew how to rewrite reports just enough to follow protocol while leaving no legal exposure. The system, originally built to prevent misconduct, had evolved into a machine, subtly reproducing prejudice under the guise of procedural response. No one within that system could say, "I didn't know anymore," because now the press had done the job that internal investigations had long avoided. The Washington Post published the entire chain of incidents on its digital platform, allowing readers to examine each patrol log. The Root launched a dedicated section tracking every official statement from the Charleston Police Department and City Hall, following each media inquiry. And NBC made a statement no longer speculative. What happened to Dana Monroe wasn't unusual. What's unusual is that she survived, had proof, and had the voice to make the system hesitate for the first time. This time, no one remained untouched. The pattern had surfaced, and society had begun redrawing the boundaries of what could be called standard procedure. The implications were no longer abstract. What had once passed as operational judgment was now revealed as a culture of calibrated avoidance, where bias had no name but a consistent outcome. In confronting the truth that had long been buried beneath paperwork and protocol, the public wasn't just reacting to one event, it was confronting a mechanism, and that mechanism was no longer invisible. The first hearing took place on Monday morning, inside a soundproof room on the 4th floor of the Interagency Behavioral Oversight Office, a space typically used for civil claims involving city and state-level law enforcement. The door was closed tightly, no cameras barred from the lobby, but the tension inside couldn't be contained. Everyone understood that what was said today wouldn't just determine the future of one officer. It would either trigger or block a deeper inquiry into Charleston's internal training framework. Chad Brenner appeared as the primary respondent. He arrived on time, tall, uniform crisply ironed, unarmed, posture rigid, eyes steady. But his demeanor didn't suggest a man ready for dialogue. It was the embodiment of a training model. No elaboration, no reflection, just the insistence that nothing wrong occurred. His expression never shifted. His tone was flat, neutral, locked into the kind of procedural phrasing drilled into officers during threat-response simulations. His attorney began with a pre-written statement. My client acted fully within the boundaries of approved training protocol. There was no force, no discriminatory language, no active threat. He responded based on reasonable suspicion and adhered to departmental guidelines. When asked why he drew his weapon on an unarmed civilian, Brenner repeated the same line 3 times. I observed an individual, not residing in the area, carrying a high-end handbag, exhibiting signs of behavioral unease. I determined the situation had the potential to escalate and acted to ensure safety. No one objected, but no one nodded. One panel member, a former law enforcement academy instructor, lowered his eyes, uncapped his pen, and wrote 3 words in his notebook: training script, repetition. Not because Brenner's response was incorrect, but because it was too precise. Verbatim, from a manual, not from real-world judgment. In a justice system, accuracy isn't enough. Intent matters, and Brenner's lack of personal reasoning made the deeper flaw obvious. Maybe it wasn't his fault. Maybe the system had built him to react that way. From there, the focus of questioning shifted, no longer about Brenner as an individual, but about how officers are taught to interpret what's suspicious. An independent expert asked, when a black woman stands alone with a Chanel bag, what behavior made you classify her as uneasy? Brenner didn't answer. He looked to his lawyer. An objection was raised, but it didn't land fast enough. The silence said more. Brenner couldn't respond because he hadn't been trained to parse the line between cultural unfamiliarity and legitimate threat. The hearing didn't conclude that day, but the doubt had already spread. The issue wasn't incompetence. It was how coldly and mechanically the system defines risk. For the first time in years, that system was forced to face its own programming, and the question hovering in the air wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was this: if procedures are repeated without room for analysis, do they actually make society safer or merely quieter under the weight of unspoken fear? The most striking moment of the hearing didn't come from any testimony, nor from the lawyers. It came from a large LED screen that lit up late in the morning as the Federal Quantitative Behavioral Review Group took the floor. No emotion, no dramatic language, just numbers, dry, exact, and undeniable. On the screen, a timeline chart appeared. Over 18 months working in East Charleston, Chad Brenner conducted 236 street stops under the justification of reasonable suspicion. Of those, 91% of the individuals who stopped were people of color. But what silenced the entire room was the second line. In the 17 instances where Brenner's hand reached toward his holster, not a single one involved a white individual. No arrests were made, almost no citations issued. When an independent oversight officer stood and asked bluntly, "Can you point to a single policy that defines carrying a Chanel bag as a potential threat?" Brenner didn't respond. He turned to his attorney. The legal representative quickly objected to the question as lacking technical basis, but the reaction came too late to erase the impression now etched into the room. What followed could no longer be managed. Data pulled from patrol route mapping software, overlaid with behavioral analysis. It redrew Brenner's movements week by week and exposed a disturbing pattern. He repeatedly diverted from assigned routes to enter middle and upper-class neighborhoods, particularly after patrol reports noted the presence of a person of color in those areas. A series of notes from Brenner's own patrol logs was also shown. Short lines but haunting. Male subject, leather shoes, dark blazer, not familiar. Or female, designer bag, light blouse, doesn't match context. Behavioral experts identified this as a clear case of bias detection drift, a form of cognitive distortion in threat assessment shaped by repeated, unchecked exposure to racial bias. In other words, Brenner was behaving as trained, but what he was trained into was the product of a system that never corrected itself. The hearing ended without a formal ruling, without charges, without indictment, but the echo it left behind resonated louder than any verdict. From a data standpoint, Chad Brenner wasn't an outlier. He was mass-produced. And if the system continues to define suspicious as deviating from the white middle-class norm, then more Brenners will appear, wearing new uniforms, citing new codes in different neighborhoods. The brutal truth is this: Dana Monroe survived. She had a federal badge, a husband who arrived in time, a witness with a camera, but no one can guarantee those things next time. There may be no Marcus, no footage, no glint of credentials in the sunlight, just a gunshot. And afterward, a report, subject non-compliant, handled per protocol. That's not a warning. It's a forecast. If the system keeps refusing to look at the numbers it created. Throughout the entire hearing, Marcus Monroe never once stepped up to speak. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask to speak on his wife's behalf, and didn't react, even as certain members of the panel let their glances drift toward him, as if expecting some movement from the man who silently commanded the room. But Marcus's silence wasn't passive. He didn't stand behind Dana to shield her. He sat beside her, an invisible but weighty force. Even the seat he chose, third row, not distant enough to seem disengaged, not close enough to overshadow her role, said everything. He wasn't there to observe. He was there to read the map. As each question was asked, each chart displayed, each minute ticked past in that sealed chamber, Marcus took no notes, offered no nods, tapped nothing on his phone. But those watching closely saw it. His eyes didn't wander. They computed. Nothing said in that room escaped his focus, not just because Dana was at the center, but because everything unfolding was something he had seen before, had predicted years ago, in another capacity, embedded in a deeper system. Hours after the hearing adjourned, a confidential document arrived at the Interagency Behavioral Oversight Office. No envelope, no statement. Just a compressed data file injected directly into the secure system using a high-clearance access code. The recipient, a veteran coordinator responsible for securing archives with over 17 years in the office, froze the moment the access signature appeared. The code, MM4SC Strat. Very few people held credentials matching that format, and of those, only one had the strategic interagency clearance, the analytical authority, and the exact reason to send this file at this time to this place, without needing to explain a word. Marcus Monroe. The file contained 47 pages, titled Implicit Bias and Pattern Conditioning in Uniformed Profiling, Training Modules 20152021. It wasn't a press leak, not a complaint, not publicized evidence. It was a technical dossier, a detailed breakdown of training modules implemented at county and district levels, specifically targeting patrol forces and racially mixed communities where behavioral expectations had been shaped by dominant norms. The document stated clearly, officers were taught to identify suspicious behavior not based on actual conduct, but on deviations between external appearance and the prevailing socio-cultural norms of the area. In other words, a black individual dressed too well in a white neighborhood or carrying luxury items beyond the median income for that zip code was automatically flagged for strategic observation. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, but the more one read, the clearer it became. Racial bias wasn't just present. It had been encoded, modeled, and operationalized as part of the official risk assessment process. Marcus said nothing about it. He attached no commentary. Not a single word of protest was embedded in the file, but the act of sending it, not through legal channels, not to the press, but straight into the behavioral control architecture, delivered a blow that shattered Brenner's entire defense of no malicious intent. Because from that moment, the council could no longer investigate the man alone. They had to look at the system that had produced him. And that was when it became clear. This husband didn't need to hold a mic. He didn't need to shout for justice. He only needed to appear, quietly insert a single piece of data into the right place, and let the system hear the sound of its own foundations cracking. The file Marcus submitted wasn't a personal reaction. It wasn't a defense. And it certainly wasn't a legal maneuver. It was a technical data packet compiled by the very law enforcement units under the jurisdiction of Charleston's system. It had a clearly defined timeline spanning from 2015 to 2021. And was implemented as an internal training module for patrol officers at the district and county levels. Its official name was Situational Profiling Enhancements, but internally officers passed it around with another name, Behavioral Analysis Without Asking, meaning no need to ask questions, no need for clear violations. If someone didn't fit the local visual norm, they were flagged as a potential threat. The module laid out detailed soft alert indicators officers were trained to monitor, clothing that exceeded local economic standards, accessories deemed contextually incompatible, eye movements interpreted as area rescanning, and gestures suggesting an inappropriate sense of ownership over objects. In the administrative documents, these were labeled under the term disparity-legged behavior. In effect, it was a mechanism that legitimized profiling people of color or minority individuals when they appeared in areas the system quietly considered culturally owned by white residents. When Dana Monroe, a black woman, carrying a Chanel bag, wearing light colors, standing with confidence, walked into Riverside Row, the model flagged her instantly as subject for surveillance. Brenner didn't invent that alert response. He was trained to react that way, especially during his re-entry into the force under the stated need for support in managing behavioral decision-making following prior control issues. Marcus, in his capacity as a former strategic advisor to interagency law enforcement data programs, didn't just know the module existed. He knew exactly which departments had used it, how many officers had been trained under it, and how many technically incorrect but procedurally sound encounters it had generated. Submitting the file, without speaking at the hearing after sitting silently in the third row, was the warning. He didn't need to say anything to the system. He forced the system to read its own paperwork and answer itself. Crucially, Marcus didn't submit the file to defend Dana's honor, because if Dana had needed defending, she wouldn't have stood so firmly alone at the hearing. He sent the file to remind both the council and the public that Dana wasn't an exception. She was the final point in a real policy chain, designed by real people, signed off by real titles. He didn't send it to accuse. He sent it to shut down the exit route from denial, to make the system understand if it wanted to avoid being dragged into federal court, it had better start by answering honestly who wrote this, who approved it, who let it run for 6 years without a single challenge. From the moment that file surfaced, all attempts at dodging accountability lost ground. Truth was no longer an accusation, it was evidence. And Marcus Monroe, the man who never took the podium, never offered a defense, had placed the system in a position where it had to answer to itself, through the very language, signatures, and procedures it once believed were untouchable. 3 days after the hearing, while the media storm still swirled around Chad Brenner's defense and the exposed behavior charts from the courtroom, Dana Monroe disappeared from every lens. She didn't appear in court. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't step onto any studio set. Instead, she attended a small community forum in the city's southern district, once a focal point for early law enforcement accountability campaign. The room held just 50 seats. No cameras, no host, no media, only independent members, a few civilian witnesses, and some who had once been labeled persons of interest simply for being too different from the neighborhoods they lived in. No one expected Dana to come, but she did, quietly, unannounced, and when she placed a thin folder on the speaking table, every eye turned to her. There was no introduction, no lengthy statement. Dana opened the first page, looked at a single line, and read in an even voice, Renee Collins, age 29, waitress, single mother, no criminal record, no mental health diagnosis, detained for 3 hours at Southgate Holding Facility, arresting officer, Chad Brenner, jail 2017. The room froze. Even those unfamiliar with the name paused, because Dana's tone didn't carry vengeance. It carried certainty. She continued, uninterrupted. The file stated Renee was held for failure to comply with an on-site administrative check. No video, no witnesses, just a short summary. Subject mildly agitated, irrational response held for public safety. 3 hours later, Renee was released. 48 hours after that, she was found unconscious in her apartment and died 5 hours later in the hospital. Medical report, unspecified stroke, no second autopsy, no inquiry. Her family couldn't afford legal counsel. The case faded, and a month later, the name Renee Collins vanished from every investigatory record, as if she had never existed within the pattern of misconduct. Dana paused briefly, then said, without a tremor, "That year I didn't know. But 2 years later, when I was granted internal access during an investigation into a string of Southgate reports, I came across a file marked with a slash. Inside was a copy of a detention memo. The officer's name blacked out. No way to verify, no witnesses, no complaint filed. But Dana photographed that page. She kept it for 3 years, until the day her husband gave her the Chanel bag and asked, "Why do you hang on to these things?" She replied, "Because one day we might need to remember what others are trying to forget." That day came. When Brenner drew his gun in front of her in public without warning, her first feeling wasn't fear. It was recognition, a cold, familiar recognition. She didn't see the grip of the weapon, she saw the name that had been erased from a record. A woman with no one to protect her, no video, no oversight council, no Marcus Monroe stepping out of an SUV. Dana hadn't known once, but now she did. And if the system refuses to look back at what it's buried, then no defense left standing today has the right to call itself justification. The document Dana Monroe revealed in that small room wasn't a call for legal action. There was no word like prosecution, no phrase like request for further investigation. She didn't say Chad Brenner killed Renee Collins. No blame, no claim, no conclusion. But what she laid on the table, flat pages with no logo, no header, just facts and timelines, forced everyone in the room to confront a silent truth. Some deaths had been deemed unworthy of remembrance by the system. A black woman, unknown, poor, detained without a clear reason, released without a full report, and dead in silence. No organization had ever asked why. No one in the system had reviewed the process. And if no one had happened to remember her, 6 years later, Renee Collins's name would have stayed buried beneath thousands of anonymous entries, forever erased from the record. Not a single police department in those 6 years had flagged the 2017 detention as a possible case of excessive response. No conference had questioned why the custody report had no footage, why the release time didn't match the hospital's medical log. The Civilian Oversight Commission's data held nothing on the incident because no one had filed for an inquiry and the deceased had no one left to speak for her. If Dana hadn't once read a redacted statement that caught her attention, and if she hadn't almost become the next name in that same quiet chain, then Renee would remain a non-event, without witnesses or echoes. A technical handling, an internalized incident, a situation difficult to verify, and the system had long operated this way, selecting who gets remembered and who can disappear without disturbing the administrative order. Dana didn't stand up after reading. She simply closed the folder. She didn't raise it as evidence. She didn't announce a lawsuit. She didn't threaten a federal referral. She just looked down for 1 second, then looked up. Her expression wasn't that of someone recounting a tragedy. It was the look of someone who had just lifted the final rug, where the dirt was thought to be permanently buried. A gaze that didn't ask anyone to cry, but made everyone present confront the fact that this hadn't happened just once. It may have happened many times, and they hadn't remembered, because no one had ever asked them to. Marcus sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He gave no prompt. He didn't need to, because everything that needed to be heard was already echoing in the silence that followed. And in that moment, the council members, the same people who had sat across from Dana throughout the hearing, who had once treated the Brenner incident as an exception to be handled, realized this wasn't a singular case. This was the start of a reverse discovery chain. Because if they opened Brenner's full record, if they traced every internal transfer, every reappointment from detention unit, every enhanced behavioral risk recognition training, if they tracked every incident without footage, if they compiled the names of people detained and released with no full documentation, they wouldn't just find one individual's misconduct. They would find a system designed to filter memory, select who could be forgotten, and legitimize every wrongful act simply because the person it happened to had no way to fight back. This time, someone lived to tell it. Someone still had the documents. Someone had the strength to name a death that had been erased from official logs. Dana didn't ask for pity. She didn't need it. What she demanded, and perhaps achieved, was this: forcing the system to remember what it had once erased, not with emotion, with fact, not with tears, with evidence. And if justice still has value, it must begin here, by giving back names to those the system once assumed no one would remember. 2 weeks after the final hearing, while public outrage had yet to subside, and clips of Chad Brenner drawing his weapon continued to spread by the millions each day, another event quietly shook the system. A class action lawsuit was filed with the federal court for the 3rd District. The signatories did not represent any major legal organization, not the ACLU, not the Southern Poverty Law Center. Instead, it came from a provisional coalition of 9 independent attorneys, each from a different background. One, a former prosecutor, one from an internal affairs division, one a former strategic security advisor, and 2 who had led state-level racial discrimination investigations. They weren't media fixtures. But when they signed a single complaint together, the system understood they weren't here to restore one person's dignity. They were here to hold the entire architecture accountable for how it had operated in the shadows for years. The lawsuit didn't name individual defendants, nor did it assign criminal charges to any specific officer. Instead, it targeted three structural pillars that had upheld Charleston's machinery of impunity. 1. The Charleston Police Department, accused of failing to regulate and even enabling covert discriminatory behavior through flawed training doctrine. 2. The Interagency Behavioral Oversight Offices, charged with repeatedly overlooking, muting, or suspending tracking of behavioral irregularities reported from the field. And 3. Private civil security staffing firms, entities that served as unofficial escape routes, allowing problem officers to be administratively reassigned without formal investigation, functioning as legal backdoors for misconduct. The filing totaled 58 pages, including 42 pages of appendices containing analytical reports, behavioral models, anonymous testimonies, and a list of administrative decisions, with signs of formalized reappointments without verification. At least 18 individuals formally subjected to unlawful detention appeared under anonymity. These were not Dana's people. They were not arrested by Brenner, but they had all been harmed by the same system that produced him. And now they chose to appease, not to settle scores, but to ensure no one else inherited their fate. Dana Monroe's name did not appear in the lawsuit. She gave no statements, signed no authorizations, and submitted no testimony. But anyone who read the first 5 pages could see this effort was born the moment she stood in that small community forum and read aloud the name Renee Collins, the forgotten woman erased by the system. The 12-page document Dana had presented, with no legal logo, no official stamp, was the spark that ignited the most comprehensive legal confrontation Charleston had ever faced. This was no longer a moral debate, no longer a gentle conversation between parties. This was a structural counteroffensive, methodical, precise, and without plans for compromise. And it was the final line of the complaint that crystallized the lawsuit's purpose, a sentence many later referred to as the system's mirror. We are not asking for change out of compassion. We are demanding accountability for what you built. We are not replacing the system. We are forcing it to look in the mirror. Marcus Monroe did not appear at any press conference. He didn't sign the lawsuit, didn't join public legal strategy sessions with the independent attorney group, and didn't speak to the media. But on the same night the complaint was filed with the federal court for District 3, a string of high-level security access logs appeared on the National Behavioral Monitoring System, specifically from 3 key nodes: Charleston, Greenville, and Southgate, the former facility tied to multiple scandals in 2018. The IP addresses revealed more than simple record checks. They triggered interagency behavioral data cross-linking, a deep scan protocol only activated under 2 circumstances: when there is evidence of coordinated internal retaliation, or when there is a potential indirect threat to a tier-level federal asset. In other words, someone with significant clearance had quietly built a protective perimeter around Dana Monroe, and no one announced who initiated it. No internal memos were leaked. No posts or public statements surfaced. But those who had worked with Marcus Monroe during his time as a strategic advisor to the Pentagon understood immediately. This was second-layer shielding, a non-official defensive protocol Marcus himself had proposed during the early phases of domestic conflict oversight planning. It didn't protect with laws, it protected with data. It didn't conflict with authority, but with traceability. It didn't name or shame potential aggressors, but it made sure they understood that every move was logged and would not vanish, and any deviation, even in the shadows, could be mirrored back. Within 48 hours of the lawsuit going public, 3 journalists who had previously published false or misleading articles about Dana quietly submitted formal apologies to their editors, an action almost unheard of in today's media landscape. 2 anonymous accounts that had posted doctored images and character smears were locked out, flagged, and removed by 3 different platforms. A private contractor that had provided staffing support for Brenner during the Cellgate investigation period received a notice of reopened tax review for the past 5 years. No search warrants. No fines, just precise, deliberate moves. Each one a compressed warning shot. No blood spilled, but enough to make those who operate behind closed doors freeze in place. No one claimed credit. No one spoke up, but the entire system understood. The hidden order was being reset. And this time, no one could pretend not to see it. Dana had not asked for any of it. She didn't know, or didn't want to know, what was moving behind her. But Marcus knew. He understood that when a power structure is pushed into defense, it fights back in the dirtiest ways. Not with statute, but with whispers. Not with reports, but with subjectless emails. And if Dana was to keep speaking truth, someone had to stand behind her and make sure the darkness didn't press close. He didn't need to be thanked, didn't need recognition. He only needed the silence to hold long enough for her voice to remain audible. And in a world where justice is often defined by who shouts the loudest, Marcus chose to stand beside him, eye silence, to protect what was right, using the one thing those in the shadows cannot fight: quiet transparency with structure. For more than a week after the class action lawsuit was filed with the federal court for the 3rd District, Charleston's response was one of organized silence. The only official statement from the police department was a cold sentence: "We will cooperate with the investigation and have no comment on an active matter." No additional suspensions were issued. No expanded press briefings held. Department heads who once appeared regularly at public forums abruptly withdrew from all voter engagements. The entire system quietly shifted into defense mode, pulling back, limiting statements, cutting media access, waiting for top-down directives. Local headlines framed it as a media flashpoint, not a structural crisis. And so everyone waited for a voice loud enough to justify self-reflection without requiring an admission of guilt. The first to step forward wasn't a familiar face to the cameras. Not a lawyer, not an activist, not a previous witness. It was a police officer, still on duty, still in uniform, still wearing a nameplate. Lieutenant Isaiah Cole, 38, of the West Division Strategic Patrol Unit, appeared unannounced at an open hearing hosted by the Civil Justice Coordination Commission. His name wasn't on the docket. He brought no delegation, no authorized paperwork, but when he stepped up to the podium, his voice didn't waver for a second. "I can't stay silent anymore, and if it has to start with the truth of what I've seen, then I'm ready." The room froze, not because he raised his voice, but because everyone knew who Cole was. No scandals, no internal investigations, no civil suits. He ranked in the top 5% of his state academy cohort. 3 commendations for field coordination performance. What no one knew. In 2019, Cole submitted a 19-page report to the Strategic Oversight Office, directly challenging the behavior recognition model based on eye movement, gait, and wardrobe mismatch with social context. In it, he argued, the model wasn't scientific, but instead amplified racial bias under the guise of behavioral metrics. He sent it, waited. No response ever came. A month later, Cole was reassigned out of the strategic unit without explanation. He was moved to a fringe residential zone with near no crime, stripped of access to any high-level behavioral data. The reason? Noted in a single line on the reassignment memo, repositioned to align with coordination capacity. No one called it punishment, but everyone understood. Being pulled from the front line wasn't about doing something wrong. It was about refusing to comply. For the next 3 years, Cole said nothing. He performed his duties at his new post, filed no grievance, made no demands for reinstatement, but when he saw the video of Dana Monroe held at gunpoint, not for resistance, not for threat, but for walking into the wrong neighborhood with the right kind of bag, in the wrong color skin, he knew silence was no longer an option. For him, that image wasn't a shock. It was the end result of every training, every slide deck, every appearance risk module he'd once been told not to question. And when Isaiah Cole took the podium that day, no folder in hand, no lapel mic, no speech to read, one empty chair in the back of the Charleston PD's internal hearing room, became more visible than ever. The chair once reserved for monitor internal dissent, but this time no one sat in it, because the man who had once been removed from that seat had walked out and spoken out. At the hearing that day, Isaiah Cole didn't step forward like someone making history. He didn't stand tall as a symbol, didn't carry a stamped statement, didn't have a mic tucked behind his collar. He simply spoke, slowly, steadily, without emotion, as if the last thing he needed to do wasn't to convince anyone, but to release something that had sat in his chest for far too long. He spoke of training sessions where officers were taught to watch for individuals wearing leather shoes, shiny watches, but driving cars registered outside high-income neighborhoods. He described records of behavior incompatible with social space conditions, the administrative phrase for a black person in a suit, walking with too much confidence, and thus flagged as requiring further inspection. He explained how certain reports marked with the keyword subject of unclear presence were routinely prioritized, shifting the system from passive observation to active suspicion, while reports showing no threat were quietly edited before storage. No one interrupted him. No one stepped in to soften the testimony with phrases like procedural error, because everyone in the room understood what Cole was describing had existed and was still operating under different names in different places. When asked why he chose this moment to speak up, Cole didn't deflect. He didn't talk about an awakening. He didn't mention being inspired by justice. He simply said without pause, "I used to think I had time to fix it from the inside, that if I stayed patient, stayed decent, I could shift parts of the system without breaking it. But when I saw Dana Monroe, a woman with no weapon, no violation, no resistance, have a gun pointed at her in broad daylight, and the system still called it a standalone incident, I understood. Silence isn't harmless. It's killing people, slowly, quiet." And the moment he said that, the room seemed to slow, not because of the words themselves, but because everyone knew. The man standing before them was an officer with no disciplinary record, no scandal, no policy violations. And if someone like that had to break the silence, then the system had made silence a form of complicity. At the end of the hearing, no one pressured Cole to sign anything. No lawyers advised him to protect himself with immunity, but he firmly and voluntarily offered to hand over all copies of internal training emails he had saved between 2017 and 2020, files he once thought he'd never need, but couldn't bring himself to delete. He didn't ask for anonymity. He didn't request his address be hidden. He simply said, "If I, a uniformed officer, never discipline, don't have the courage to tell the truth, then who will?" And that sentence, lacking slogans, absent ideal, sparked a chain reaction the system had not anticipated. Within 48 hours of Cole's testimony, HR departments at several nearby police departments began receiving internal requests to reopen access to archived training materials. 2 retired officers from Greenville sent letters to the Interagency Behavioral Oversight Office requesting in-person meetings with federal investigators. One administrative clerk at Southgate, who had never appeared in any prior reports, filed for identity protection and registered to share unredacted versions of records edited since 2016. And then from independent watchdog groups, from long marginalized community boards, from those who had once believed Brenner was just a bad apple, a new, sharper, unavoidable question began to rise. How many Brenners had been protected by silence? And how many other names has this system hidden behind its manufactured order? Isaiah Cole may have been the first to stand up, but when he stepped down from that witness stand, no one believed he would be the last. Less than a week after Lieutenant Isaiah Cole's seismic testimony, the silence Charleston had worked so hard to maintain began to fracture. Social media, once dismissed as too emotional to shape public discourse, became the platform for dissecting collective memory. Videos that were once ignored resurfaced. Black citizens pulled over for going the wrong way, teens frisked for wearing hoodies, and women questioned for laughing too loudly in public parks. All of it retrieved, analyzed, and compared. In inner-city high schools, sociology teachers were, for the first time, permitted to use the video of Dana Monroe being held at gunpoint as official material for class discussion, no longer stamped as too sensitive. And in Charleston itself, once cautiously quiet, hundreds began signing a petition titled, "The System Cannot Fix Itself. Let the People Oversee It." They called for an independent civilian oversight board, detached from the department, separate from City Hall, and free from police budgeting. On Monday morning, just as local networks were reporting rising public pressure, an internal email was sent at exactly 6:12 a.m. from Charleston Police HQ. It was 3 paragraphs long, no dramatic heading, no gratitude. Just a flat declaration: Police Chief Alvin K. Maddox was resigning due to an inability to maintain necessary neutrality in the current environment. No press conference, no farewell to staff. Within 3 hours, his name was scrubbed from the department's official site. But what shook insiders wasn't his absence. It was what had led to it. Just 3 days earlier, a cache of leaked emails revealed that Maddox had received at least 4 internal warnings about the department's use of profiling by dress and social cues. Warnings he had shelved with notes like, "Review after recruitment cycle." The emails were ignored until Dana Monroe was staring down a gun, and the system had nowhere left to hide. The leak wasn't massive, just 23 emails, but each line read like a map of sanctioned bias written in administrative code. No one said race. No sentence declared black people are a threat, but lines like communities with culturally misleading presentation, patterns of spatial incompatibility, and consumer behavior exceeding reported income all pointed in one direction: exclusion without having to name it. The documents exposed a covert structure of discrimination maintained through phrases like discretionary application of demographic stability protocols. Stripped of bureaucratic language, it meant see someone who doesn't fit, intervene, then justify it in policy terms. From that language, officers like Brenner concluded that a woman with a Chanel bag in the wrong neighborhood was something that needed handling. And from those sterile lines, cases like Renee Collins's, and many others, were quietly removed from any re-review process, because no one thought those names deserved to come up again. The pressure that forced Maddox out didn't come from a court order or a trending hashtag. It came from a perfect alignment of long-buried sediment finally surfacing. When someone like Isaiah Cole spoke up, when Dana's video kept circulating, when documents started to leak, Charleston's system had no remaining moves but to eject the one sitting highest. But the problem wasn't just Maddox, it was the chair itself. The seat that once shielded him no longer had the strength to hold anyone. And those who had always been outsiders to power began to realize, when truth is loud enough, no position built on selective blindness can remain stable. That morning, it became clear. Systems don't collapse all at once. They erode, fracture, then surrender to their own suppressed weight. And when the final crack splits through the structure, the first thing to fall is never the walls, it's the chair no one can sit in anymore. The resignation of Director Maddox was not seen by the people of Charleston as a victory. It was merely a signal, a confirmation that the system had started to crack, and from this point on, the people no longer needed to wait for orders from above. Within 72 hours, a digital petition surfaced across 3 different platforms bearing the same title: "We cannot be surveilled if we are the ones watching back." Over 12,000 signatures were collected calling for the creation of the Charleston Civilian Oversight Council, an independent, publicly elected body with the authority to access behavioral data from law enforcement and to petition for terminations directly through the state prosecutor's office, bypassing local police department approval. What stood out most, the petition wasn't sent to City Hall. It went straight to the South Carolina Judicial Committee, accompanied by a 37-page dossier comparing records, detailing how internal review departments had distorted public complaints, reclassified violent allegations as professional misunderstandings, and buried patterns of systemic bias across 3 key years: 2016, 2017, and 2019. In the streets of Charleston, instead of protests, residents held nightly community gatherings, one neighborhood at a time. No loudspeakers, no banners, just circles of people gathered in rec centers, public libraries, barber shops, cafes, even churchyards. No one talked about overthrowing. No one chanted slogans. They talked about the right to know, about what it feels like to be pulled over without cause, about the look they once dismissed as too sensitive, now understood to be a product of trained bias. One middle-aged man shared how he'd been stopped walking home from the pharmacy for wearing a black tracksuit. A college student recalled being asked to open her bag at her campus gate for suspicious posture. All of them had once stayed silent. Now, that silence had shifted. It had become a warning aimed back at the very system that once relied on it to function. At a small forum in Southbridge, an older woman, silver-haired, boy-rough goth, stood up and said, "I used to think these things only happened to people who had something wrong, people who dressed strangely, spoke loudly, or had a record. I never thought it would happen to someone like Dana. Quiet, kind, well-dressed, educated. But now I see it's because they're everything right that the system feels threatened, and it's because we were silent for so long that it thought it had permission. I see now. The problem was never them. The problem is we haven't been watching long enough." That line spread across community groups. No graphics, no campaign hashtags. It became the reason people began rewriting how power would be monitored, not with opposing force, but with memory and data. At these gatherings, people started listing traffic stops without clear cause, reviewing videos that had been taken down, compiling irregular incident reports, and building open databases for public verification. Those once dismissed as uninformed civilians were now seen as living witnesses, and the one oversight force the system could no longer ignore. The Charleston system hadn't collapsed. Police still reported for duty. The prosecutor's office still opened its doors, but it could no longer pretend to be a normally functioning system. The public wasn't waiting for direction. They were redefining protection by demanding access to the very places they were once barred from: control rooms, archives, and the inboxes behind redacted emails. And this time, they didn't need to shout to be heard. They just needed to stop looking away. As the case spiraled beyond the control of local authorities, Dana Monroe became a name that no conversation about law enforcement reform could ignore. National networks ran reports, produced segments, dissected Brenner's behavior, and tracked the policies behind a gun drawn in broad daylight. But beyond the news cycle was the media's deeper hunger for a face, and Dana became the first target. Primetime talk shows pursued her through every channel: handwritten letters, legal reps, calls through former colleagues. One network even offered to sponsor an unedited soundtrack-free interview, saying, "This is the moment America needs to hear a strong black woman speak." But Dana didn't need to speak. She already had. It was the system's turn now. At exactly 4:32 a.m. Eastern, an email was sent from Dana's personal account to every outlet that had extended an invitation, from CNN and MSNBC to NPR and smaller local stations. The subject line: "I am not the story." No pleasantries. No apologies for the refusal, just a single line in the body: "I don't step on stage to help others see what they've long chosen to ignore. The truth has always been there, just unheard." Attached was a 37cc audio clip, sent only to a regional radio station, once dismissed as too obscure to matter, which, in Dana's mind, was precisely why they deserved it. They didn't need to build a TV story. They just played what was real. In the clip, Dana didn't emphasize. She didn't pause on key words. Her voice didn't tremble, but neither did it rise to perform strength. It was the voice of someone clear-eyed enough to know that survival wasn't a miracle. It was a string of luck that too many others never got. And by the time the final sentence landed, the station's entire tech team froze, as if they too had just heard a verdict, not against a man, but against a power structure that had forgotten how to be ashamed. I don't need to speak to prove I was right. That responsibility belongs to the system, not to someone who barely survived it. No one dared edit it. No music, no commentary. The radio station let the recording end in pure silence, 7 seconds long, unbroken, like an unspoken eulogy. Then, calmly, the system voice resumed, shifting to the next segment. No headlines, no interruptions, but those 37 seconds traveled faster than any coverage of the class action suit, because it wasn't just a statement, it was a boundary. Dana Monroe would not be pulled into anyone's scripted reform, no matter how well-intentioned. And then, something unexpected happened. The major media outlets, usually aggressive in chasing exclusives, didn't push back. No one accused her of arrogance. No one reworded her email into a controversial refusal, because even the press, if there was any conscience left in the profession, recognized this was the moment to step back. Dana didn't need a spotlight to validate her role. Her actions and the facts had already spoken. What she chose to preserve was her silence as a principle, not to let the system brand her pain as a narrative, not to let it label her victim, then parade her as a monument, backed by hollow applause. For the first time in years, a woman, threatened in broad daylight, who survived and exposed an entire network of wrongdoing, chose to step back, not disappear. Her name wasn't recycled on victim lists, nor was it force-fitted with the word hero. She was simply someone who did what was right and refused to become a shield for those who never stood on the right side when no cameras were rolling. Dana Monroe didn't leave behind a story to retell. She left behind a limit, a line in the sand. This time, the system would speak for itself, or collapse under the weight of its own refusal to do so. After the 37-second audio clip of Dana Monroe aired, the word victim vanished from headlines. No one referred to her with passive or sentimental titles anymore. From CNN to independent outlets, her identity was suddenly uniformly precise: legal officer, Federal Strategic Security Division. No more mentions of the Chanel bag, no more phrasing like a calm woman walking down the street. Instead, her professional record was laid out: her role in authoring investigative memos on Southgate misconduct, her work in exposing blind spots in civil behavior analytics, her collaboration with interagency constitutional rights advisors in detention settings. She was no longer the woman who nearly got shot. She was the woman who made pulling a gun no longer a casual reflex. There were no cameras capturing her face in the aftermath, no interviews filmed in living rooms. Dana didn't post a thank you. She didn't share her fear. She didn't speak of healing from trauma. Because for her, the issue wasn't fear, it was the fact that society had normalized it and called it routine. She didn't cry on television, but the documents she released, the logs, checklists, hidden data sets, and names of those quietly erased from the system, were the most forceful indictment anyone could offer. This wasn't personal. This was a structurally engineered collective failure. And from the start, Dana had refused to let herself be the excuse a broken system could hide behind. For the first time in years, a black woman wasn't turned into a symbol. She wasn't branded a survivor icon. She wasn't shoved into a narrative of gratitude for being alive. Dana Monroe didn't need to be celebrated to have value. Her worth lay in her refusal to bargain with truth. When others chased drama, she chose to leave behind a quiet space. When the world swarmed with emotion, she remained the keeper of evidence. Not out of coldness, but because she knew truth doesn't need spectacle, it just needs to stay intact. Dana never claimed center stage, and though the story revolved around her being held at gunpoint, she never occupied the spotlight. She let the system expose itself through its actions, its defensiveness, its panic when faced with documents that couldn't be edited. She didn't create a crescendo, because crescendos serve media cycles. Real change, she knew, begins when people sit down, read closely, and run out of ways to look away. In classrooms on law enforcement reform, in reopened internal files, In revised officer training proposals, no one needed to place Dana's photo on the slides, but the name Monroe appeared nonetheless, quiet, unshakable, and impossible to exclude. And so, in small conversations, in major lessons, in fears long dismissed as minority paranoia, Dana Monroe became a reference point, not because she gave a speech, not because she cried, but because she never let anyone speak for her and never let her pain be repurposed into a platform for new injustices. She didn't need her name in lights. She didn't need a hashtag. She didn't need a documentary. But everyone understood, from the moment she chose to stay silent at the right times and speak at the precise ones, every gun drawn or not, was forced to confront one simple truth. Justice isn't willing to wait anymore. On Friday afternoon, the door to Office 217 at the Charleston Police Department was opened for the last time, in silence. No farewell, no official statement. But the long-serving security guard, the one never invited into a single management meeting, knew something was ending. It was in the way the nameplate C. Brenner Unit 3 was removed from the door without a sound, as if the system itself didn't want to leave an echo behind. No one said Brenner had been fired. HR listed the record as termination of duty by organizational request, but across the city, from corner stores to university lawns, no one asked what happened. They asked what took so long. The event wasn't rebroadcast on the news, no farewell op-eds, but independent channels noted it clearly. This wasn't just an individual removed from a department. It was the first symbol unbolted from the door of a system that once believed it was untouchable. Chad Brenner, the officer who pulled a gun in broad daylight because a black woman carried a Chanel bag, now belonged to no roster, no uniform, no badge. And for the thousands who had followed from the start, the silence in the announcement said more than any justification ever could. There was nothing left to defend. No one wanted to say his name to shield the institution. That same day, at the South Carolina State Capitol, a bipartisan group of legislators introduced a bill titled the Public Enforcement Behavior Transparency Act. It would require all civilian complaint records, internal audits, and disciplinary histories of officers to be stored on an open access platform, searchable by zip code. The proposal was unprecedented, not just in its content, but in its support. For the first time, it drew backing from voters who had long supported law enforcement without question. But after Dana's video, after Cole's testimony, after the leaked emails, even those once unwilling to believe could no longer deny. If the data had been accessible sooner, the gun might never have left the holster. Back in Dana Monroe's office, the late sun filtered through sheer curtains onto her desk. Nothing dramatic, no flowers, no messages calling her a symbol, just a beige envelope in the center. Her birthday card she had meant to write for her husband. It still carried no new words since the day she bought it, but now it didn't need any, because that silence amid all the noise was itself a complete expression of what Dana believed, that justice doesn't lie in the volume of our cries, but in the system being forced to adjust without needing one last scream. Brenner left the system without anyone mourning, but the consequences of what he once did remained, etched in the public record, witnessed by hundreds of thousands. No one needed to build a monument to someone like Dana, a nameplate removed, a law written, and a blank card left untouched was enough to know this time truth didn't fade, it stayed, and it began to change how people confront power. Have you ever been misunderstood just because someone didn't really know you? Ever been underestimated, only to quietly prove you were more capable than they thought? If this story made you reflect, share it, not to argue, but so one more person might understand that some truths don't need to be loud. They just need to be heard. And if you want to keep following stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because here, we don't chase headlines. We just tell what's real.